The sky in Crystal Village, Ohio always seemed to hang a bit low, with clouds that appeared heavy and overcast. For Elizabeth Miller, it was a familiar landscape. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Mrs. Johnson. The usual hotcakes and coffee for you today." Elizabeth placed the plate down with a warm smile and stood before her regular customer. Having worked as a waitress at the local diner, Sunnyside, for 15 years, she was well liked by many residents. Her efficiency and thoughtfulness in remembering each customer's preferences were the hidden charms of this diner. "Thank you as always, Elizabeth. This town wouldn't run without you," Mrs. Johnson said kindly. However, in her eyes, there was a hint of unspoken sympathy. Elizabeth was single, and many townspeople viewed her as the poor thing. The reason lay in her appearance. She was by no means pretty, with unremarkable brown hair, oversized glasses, and a small, rounded figure that made her fade into the background. As Elizabeth returned to the counter, her cell phone vibrated. It was her mother calling. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Hello, Mom. Elizabeth, can you come over for dinner tonight? I have something important to discuss." Louise's voice was higher and more excited than usual. Something was up. Elizabeth sensed it instinctively. "Yes, of course. I'll come after my shift ends." When Elizabeth arrived at her mother's house, she could already hear animated voices from the entrance. It seemed her sister Victoria was there. Opening the door, she saw her mother and sister sitting around the dining table. Victoria's gleaming blonde hair, blue eyes, and model-like figure always commanded attention in any room. "You're finally here." Victoria bounded over excitedly. "I have incredible news." Her left hand shot out, displaying a large diamond ring sparkling on her finger. "I'm engaged to James Herbert." Elizabeth felt as if her heart had momentarily stopped. That name awakened her past. In high school, she had secretly dated him, something her family never knew. Now, he was the heir to one of the state's leading real estate development businesses, the object of many women's affections. "Congratulations, Victoria," Elizabeth managed a smile. "How long have you been dating?" "Just 3 months. But he says he fell in love with me at first sight. I've never met such a beautiful woman before," he told me. Louise beamed at Victoria's words. "This girl always enchants men. But this time she's caught a real prize." Elizabeth continued eating in silence. As she stared at her plate, memories of James from high school flooded her mind. He had been handsome and athletic, while she was an unremarkable, plain presence. Still, he had told her he was drawn to her inner self in the quiet corner of the library. However, they went their separate ways for college, and afterward, he achieved great success. She never imagined he would end up in such a relationship with her sister. The wedding is in 6 weeks. At the grand ballroom of the Herbert Hotel. "It'll be absolutely magnificent," Victoria continued. "Elizabeth, instead of being a bridesmaid, could you help with the welcome table reception? Considering your, well, appearance, it might be better if you're not in the photos." Louise clapped her hands, interrupting her words. "Don't worry so much, Victoria. Your sister will surely understand. It's your special day, everything must be perfect." Elizabeth nodded silently. Her existence had continuously been treated as the imperfect, a flaw, by her family. Since childhood, she had been told, "Be more like Victoria," and "Why don't you take better care of yourself?" But tonight, a different emotion swirled inside her. It wasn't anger, but rather a painful question. The morning of the wedding day began with a peaceful sunrise. Elizabeth had switched her early morning diner shift and was able to enjoy watching the sunrise for the first time in a while. However, that peaceful moment didn't last long. "Elizabeth, bring your makeup kit. Hurry." Her mother's voice echoed through Elizabeth's room. Elizabeth quickly got ready and headed to the Miller family home. The wedding was scheduled for the afternoon, but preparations were in full swing from the morning. For the lavish wedding at the Herbert Hotel, Victoria had hired professional makeup artists and hairstylists, but she wanted Elizabeth's collection on hand just in case. When Elizabeth arrived, the house was in a state of chaos. Dresses were hung up, bouquets placed everywhere, and Louise was on the phone making final confirmations. "You're late, Elizabeth." Victoria's accusatory voice came from upstairs. "Come up right away." Elizabeth silently made her way upstairs to Victoria's room with a tense expression. She was nervous. What should have been a simple handover of makeup supplies had an ominous feeling spreading in her chest. Entering the room, Victoria was sitting in front of a large mirror, half made up. Her beauty today was more striking than ever. Her golden hair formed gentle waves, and her blue eyes shone even brighter. "I brought it," Elizabeth said modestly, holding out her makeup pouch. Victoria glanced at it in the mirror. "Just put it down." As Elizabeth placed the pouch on the dresser, Victoria suddenly stood up. "By the way, what are you wearing today?" Elizabeth was a bit confused. "As we discussed yesterday, the navy dress. Since I'll be at the guest reception, you said something not too flashy would be." "What are you talking about?" Victoria's voice suddenly turned cold, a frown forming between her brows. "Are you seriously planning to come?" Elizabeth was bewildered. "Of course. Why wouldn't I come to my sister's wedding?" "Do you want to know why I think that?" Victoria's face contorted. "Imagine your ugly face appearing in the photos. I can't bear the thought of James's family and friends thinking my sister looks so unsightly." Elizabeth was speechless. After a silence that felt like the air had frozen, she finally squeezed out her voice. "Victoria, how could you say something so cruel? Face reality." Victoria shouted. "No one wants to see an ugly sister. Don't come to the ceremony." At that moment, the door opened and Louise entered the room. "What's going on?" I heard shouting. Victoria turned to her mother with tears in her eyes. "Mom, Elizabeth insists on coming to the wedding. But if she's there, everything will be ruined." Louise gave Elizabeth a stern look. "Elizabeth, today is your sister's special day. Are you planning to ruin it?" "But, Mom." Elizabeth's words trembled. You always only think about yourself," Louise declared. "Having a single waitress at the ceremony would ruin it. It's common sense." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. Years of pain hit her all at once. This was her family. This was where she belonged. "Fine," she finally said. "I'll go home." As Elizabeth started to turn around, Victoria grabbed her arm. "Wait. I don't believe you're really leaving. You'll show up at the hotel anyway, won't you?" "I won't do that," Elizabeth retorted, but Victoria looked into her eyes and saw the colors of anger and determination there. "Mom, I can't trust her," Victoria cried. "She'll come to ruin the ceremony." Louise sensed the tension between her daughters and quickly made a decision. "Elizabeth, I can't trust you. Come with me." Her mother grabbed her arm and dragged her downstairs and toward the back of the house. Elizabeth resisted, but Victoria joined in, and pushed by both of them, she was taken to a storage shed at the corner of the garden. "What are you doing? Stop." Despite Elizabeth's cries, the two pushed her into the shed. "Just for today," Louise said coldly. "We'll let you out after the ceremony is over. Give me your cell phone." Elizabeth, frozen in shock, handed her phone to her mother. The next moment, the storage door closed, and she heard the sound of it being locked from the outside. "Victoria." "Mom." How could you do this? Elizabeth shouted, banging on the door. But the sound of their footsteps was already fading away. Elizabeth collapsed to her knees. The light streaming through the small window moved as time passed. She sat among the gardening tools and old furniture, just crying. In the darkness, memories assailed her. The day she met James in the corner of the library during high school. How he told her he was attracted to her intelligence and kindness. The days they secretly met. When he whispered in her ear, "You're special." And 3 years ago, when they accidentally reunited in town. He had already become a successful businessman, but as soon as he saw her, he approached her as if time had stood still. "I've never forgotten you," he said. She wanted to believe those words. But there was no contact afterward, and the next thing she heard was the news of his engagement to her sister. Elizabeth leaned against the shed wall and closed her eyes. Unanswered questions swirled in her head. Had James truly forgotten about her? Or had he, too, been captivated by her sister's beauty? As time slowly passed in the darkness, Elizabeth continued to think quietly. Deep in her heart, there was still a lingering question. The grand ballroom of the Herbert Hotel was elaborately decorated in white and gold. Enormous crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and pure white roses with purple lavender arrangements lined the windows. In one corner of the room, a string quartet played soft music. James Herbert stood by the window, gazing at the scenery outside. His appearance was perfect. The custom black tuxedo fit his muscular body perfectly, and his deep brown hair was neatly styled. However, a hint of anxiety floated in his eyes. Each time he checked his watch, his expression became more tense. "James, with that face, people might think the bride has run away," his best friend Mark Sullivan approached. Mark, serving as the best man, was a friend from college days and one of the few people James truly trusted. "That's not the case," James forced a smile and replied. "It's just, something feels off." Mark tilted his head. "What do you mean? Didn't you meet the people who are about to become your stepfamily?" "Yes, of course," James said, but his heart wasn't in sync with his words. But Victoria hardly talked about her family. Especially about her sister. "She has a sister?" Mark asked, looking surprised. "That's news to me." James took a deep breath. "Her name is Elizabeth. She was supposed to be here today, but I haven't seen her yet." Mark shrugged. "She's probably running late with preparations. Women are like that." But James's anxiety remained. Leaving Mark, he headed toward the waiting room where Victoria was putting the finishing touches on her makeup. She was wrapped in a pure white wedding dress, looking like a movie heroine in her beauty. "Victoria, do you have a moment?" James said as he entered the room. Victoria looked at him through the mirror and smiled brightly. "James. They say it's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding. There's something I want to talk about." His voice was serious, and Victoria's smile clouded a little. "Where is your sister, Elizabeth?" For a moment, panic flashed across Victoria's face, but she quickly composed herself. "Oh, Elizabeth? She had a terrible headache this morning. She couldn't come due to illness." "I see," James said, but his eyes were filled with doubt. "But she seemed fine when I talked to her yesterday." This was a lie. James hadn't spoken to Elizabeth in months. However, he wanted to see Victoria's reaction. "You talked to her?" Victoria's voice rose. "That's impossible. She's hardly ever home because of her busy shifts at the diner." "I see," James said quietly. "Then I must have been mistaken." He left the room and immediately sought out Mark. Mark was already holding a whiskey, chatting with the guests. "Mark, come here a moment," James called him. When they stepped out onto the balcony, James lowered his voice and said, "I have a favor to ask. Could you go to the Miller house and check if Elizabeth is there?" Mark looked surprised. "Now? The ceremony is in an hour. You'll make it back in time." James gripped his friend's shoulder. "This is important. I feel something isn't right." Seeing his friend's serious expression, Mark nodded. "All right. I'll go." James gave Mark the address and sent him off. Meanwhile, James continued with the preparations, appearing outwardly calm. However, his heart was in turmoil. 3 months ago, when he met Victoria, it was actually because he was looking for Elizabeth. His memories with her from high school were deeply etched in his heart. Back then, his parents strongly opposed their relationship, and they went to separate universities. Still, he couldn't forget her. Returning to his hometown after becoming successful, he had been searching for Elizabeth. Then by chance, he met Victoria at a social party. When he learned she was Elizabeth's sister, James thought he could reconnect with Elizabeth through her. However, Victoria avoided the topic of her sister, and as his relationship with Victoria deepened, James gradually began to feel confused. Interrupting his thoughts, a call came in from Mark. "James, something terrible is happening." Mark's voice was filled with tension. "I arrived at the Miller house, but no one was there. However, I heard a noise from the garden shed. When I approached, I heard someone knocking from inside." James's heart raced. And the door was locked, but a side window was slightly open. "When I peeked in, Elizabeth was imprisoned inside. She's been there for over half a day." "What?" James's voice rose. "I opened the shed and got her out." According to her, Victoria and her mother locked her in. Incredibly, they did it to prevent her from coming to the ceremony. James was at a loss for words. Anger, surprise, and sadness hit him. "How is she?" "She's upset. But she says she wants to know if you remember her." Tears welled up in James's eyes. "Of course I remember. I've never forgotten her, not once." "James, there's something even more shocking." Mark's voice trembled. "According to Elizabeth, 3 years ago when you two reunited, you sent her letters. But she never received any of them. And Victoria knew about your high school relationship." It was a moment of revelation. James suddenly understood everything. Why Victoria avoided talking about her sister. Why she suddenly approached him. Why there was no response from Elizabeth to his letters. "Mark, bring Elizabeth to the hotel," James said with determination. "Tell her that today is the day the truth will be revealed." "What about the ceremony?" Mark asked in surprise. "The ceremony will proceed as planned," James said. "Although, the bride might be different." After hanging up, James took a deep breath and headed to the waiting room. Victoria had finished her preparations and was waiting with her father for the time to enter. When she saw James, she smiled brightly, but noticing his cold expression, her smile faded. "James, what's wrong?" "I want to know the truth," James said quietly but forcefully. "Why did you try to keep me away from Elizabeth? Why did you lock her in the shed?" The blood drained from Victoria's face. "What are you talking about?" "Enough lies," James said. "The person I truly love is your sister. And now I'm going to let everyone know that." He turned and headed for the ceremony hall. Victoria's scream echoed behind him, but he didn't stop. The grand ballroom was filled with 150 guests. People in formal attire were quietly conversing, waiting for the bride's entrance. A minister stood in front of the altar, and James stood next to him with a solemn expression. The organ began a quiet prelude, and the venue gradually fell silent. The march sounded, and the doors opened. Victoria, on her father's arm, entered wrapped in a pure white dress. She was smiling, but a hint of anxiety floated in her eyes. As she slowly advanced, her gaze never left James. Just a few steps from the altar, suddenly the back doors opened with a loud sound. Everyone turned in surprise. There stood Elizabeth. Her brown hair was disheveled, and her simple navy dress was slightly dirty with dust. But her eyes held a light of determination. Mark stood beside her. A murmur spread through the venue. Victoria stopped in her tracks, her face pale. Louise, seated in the front row, was frozen with her mouth open in shock. "What do you think you're doing?" Victoria's father raised his voice in anger. But James quietly stepped forward. "Everyone, I'd like to take a moment of your time." His voice was calm but resonated throughout the venue. "Today is a special day for me. However, it has taken a form different from what I had imagined." Victoria tried to step forward, but James quietly raised his hand to stop her. "The person I truly love is the woman standing at the back of this hall." A ripple of murmurs spread through the venue. Elizabeth stood frozen, unable to move. "Many of you may not know Elizabeth Miller," James continued. "She works as a waitress at the Crystal Village diner. She may not have a glamorous appearance, but her inner self is the most beautiful I have ever encountered." James slowly walked toward Elizabeth. "We met in high school. In the corner of the library, she taught me the wonder of poetry. For the first time in my life, I felt someone saw me for who I was, not for my appearance or family background." The guests watched with bated breath. However, we were young men and walked different paths in life. Still, I could never forget her. And 3 years ago, when I returned to my hometown, I began searching for her. James looked at Victoria. She was crying, but her eyes held anger. "Then I met Victoria. When I learned she was Elizabeth's sister, I thought I could reconnect with Elizabeth through her. But lies," Victoria shouted. "He loves me. Elizabeth, always trying to take everything from me." "Victoria," James's voice rang cold. "You hid my letters from Elizabeth. And you lied to her, telling her I had forgotten about her." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. She looked at James and barely squeezed out her voice. "Did you really remember me?" James stood before her and gently took her hand. "Not a day went by that I forgot." At that moment, Louise rose from her seat. Her expression mixed anger and shame. "This is unacceptable. To shame our family like this. Victoria is the suitable bride." But her words did not shake James's determination. "Mrs. Miller, for years, you refused to see Elizabeth's worth. You locked her in a shed, trying to exclude her from this ceremony. Why? Because her appearance didn't match your idea of a perfection." The venue fell completely silent. Louise was at a loss for words and sank back into her seat. "What I loved was Elizabeth's kindness," James continued. "Her compassion and strength. She has always put others first, living without asserting her own value." James continued speaking. "And today, I want to ask her." He slowly knelt on one knee. A murmur rose from the venue. "Elizabeth Miller, will you marry me? It doesn't have to be right now. I'll wait until you're ready." Elizabeth covered her mouth with trembling hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, someone had publicly acknowledged her worth. For the first time, she was recognized as enough. "James," she barely voiced. "But I am." "You are beautiful," James said. "Others may not see it, but I do. And that's what matters." Elizabeth slowly nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. From the back of the venue, a woman stood up and started applauding. It was Mrs. Johnson, the regular customer Elizabeth served at the diner every day. The man seated next to her also stood up and joined the applause. Gradually, people throughout the venue began to stand up one by one. Victoria, with her face contorted in anger and humiliation, grabbed the hem of her dress and ran out of the venue. Louise followed after her. But amid the confusion, the sound of applause continued unabated. James took Elizabeth's hand and smiled. "It's a bit ahead of schedule, but the minister is still here. How about having the ceremony today?" Elizabeth shook her head with a smile. "No, today is different. We don't need to rush. Let's start in the right timing, in the right way." James nodded, showing respect for her wisdom. "You're right." Elizabeth looked around the venue. For the first time, she stood before many people without feeling ashamed. She had always judged her worth through the eyes of others. But now, she had taken the first step toward knowing her own value. "James, I'm happy to meet everyone," she said, addressing the venue. "But today is not our day. I apologize to everyone, but please enjoy the party at this lovely hotel. Our story will be for another day." Saying this, Elizabeth took James's hand, and the two headed toward the back doors of the venue. Just before the doors closed, Elizabeth turned back and said one last thing. "And I am proud to be a single waitress." A year later, in early summer, bells rang at a small church overlooking Lake Erie. Soft sunlight illuminated the altar through colorful stained glass, and Elizabeth, dressed in a simple white lace dress, smiled in James's arms. "Elizabeth Miller, do you accept James as your lifelong companion?" Elizabeth took a deep breath and answered with a voice full of conviction. "Yes, I do." The small church was filled with their true friends. Regular customers and colleagues from the diner, James's friends from college days. Victoria and Louise were not there. But that was the couple's choice. After the ceremony, at a small reception in a seaside restaurant, Mark raised his glass and began a speech. "A year ago, I attended a wedding. The events of that day took an unexpected turn, but looking back, it was a moment that demonstrated the power of true love," he smiled. To Elizabeth and James, to the beginning of their new life. All attendees raised their glasses, and voices of blessing resonated. Elizabeth's life had changed dramatically. With James's encouragement and support, she opened the cafe she had dreamed of for years. Named a Chapter 1, the place where people could enjoy books and delicious food had become popular locally. She still occasionally stood in the kitchen, baking her specialty apple pie. And another change was within herself. Elizabeth no longer saw herself through the eyes of others. When she stood before the mirror, she recognized and took pride in her strength and kindness. Meanwhile, Victoria left town after the wedding commotion. The last she heard, Victoria had started a new life in California. Louise remained alone in the house, gradually becoming imprisoned in her loneliness. Occasionally, she was seen coming up to Elizabeth's cafe, but she never entered. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, placing his hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "Just memories," she smiled. "The journey that brought us here." Toward the end of the reception, Elizabeth stepped out onto the terrace alone. The beautiful evening light dyed the lake's surface golden. At that moment, she heard the door opening behind her. Turning around, there stood Victoria. "I didn't send you an invitation," Elizabeth said quietly. "Yes, I know," Victoria answered in a small voice. She had lost her former arrogance and seemed somehow diminished. "But I wanted to see you." Victoria held out an envelope. "I want you to read this." "Not now. When you have time." Elizabeth silently accepted the envelope. "I didn't come here to forgive you," Elizabeth said quietly. "That will take time. But if you've taken a look at your own life, that's a good thing. Victoria nodded and turned to leave. Elizabeth tucked the envelope into her pocket and gazed at the lake again. She understood the difference between forgiving and forgetting. She would never forget the pain of the past. But she was no longer bound by it. "Elizabeth, it's time to cut the cake," James came to call her. She turned with a smile and took his hand. Accepting the past as the past, she began walking toward her new chapter. Her worth was no longer determined by others' evaluations. It was within herself and had always been there. "To new beginnings," she said with a smile.